I am Martha Seelman. I'm the Executive Director of Studio Art Quilt Associates, also known as SAQA SAQA. And SAQA is one of 6 organizations that have been hosting these textile talks. Each Wednesday at 2 o'clock Eastern, we have a different organization hosting a different type of talk. So today, SAQA is presenting Conversation with the Artists, and we are collaborating with the National Quilt Museum, where this exhibition, Musica, is currently installed. And the National Quilt Museum was just able to open their doors again on Monday. And so they're starting to have people come through to see the exhibition in person, and you get to enjoy it virtually. I wanted to just say a few words about SAQA for those of you who are not yet SAQA members. SAQA is an organization that devoted to promoting the art quilt, and we have about 3,700 members in 39 countries around the world. Our members receive a quarterly journal. They're invited to an annual conference, although this year it was a virtual conference. We also have an awful lot of different kinds of educational programming and a very robust exhibition program. In any given year, SAQA travels somewhere between 15 and 17 global exhibitions to multiple venues around the world. We also have a very active regional exhibition program that adds somewhere around 30 additional exhibition opportunities for our members. Musica is one of our current exhibitions, and obviously the idea is that music and visual arts have a lot of overlap and interaction, and we got a really wonderful response to the call for entry. It premiered at the National Quilt Museum, was open for a short while, and then COVID-19 happened. They had to close their doors. We started to prepare this presentation, and fortunately they were able to reopen as of Monday. And so if you are in the Paducah, Kentucky area, you can actually go and see this in person. At the end of its run at the museum, it will be traveling, and all of the information about where it is will be on the SAQA website, SAQA.com. We're going to next be starting a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Rachael Baar, who is the museum curator at the National Quilt Museum, and she'll be sharing a little bit about the museum and then introducing our artist panelists. Rachael.
Welcome. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be a part of this textile talk, and the National Quilt Museum is always thrilled to be working with SAQA. We have a long relationship, and to be able to be a part of this is always very exciting for us. Greetings now from the National Quilt Museum, and yes, we are open. We are thrilled to be reopened. We are in Paducah, Kentucky, so as Martha said, please come by and see the Musica in person. We are a contemporary art museum featuring the work of today's quilt and fiber artists. More than 115,000 visitors annually visit the museum, our galleries, our touring exhibitions. We are a destination for cultural arts enthusiasts from around the world. Musica was specially curated for the National Quilt Museum. It was something that we worked out to help celebrate the Paducah Symphony's 40th anniversary. So this is very special to be here in Paducah, and so we are thrilled to have it as a part of our exhibition. We'd be even more happy if we can have more visitors that will come to see it in person. I'm glad that you were able to get the virtual look, but seeing it in person would be so much more. But let's get started with today's Textile Talks and with our first artist, Susan Bianchi. Sue?
Thank you. I live in Saratoga, California, and I am so happy to be part of the Musica exhibit, as well as to have a piece hanging in the National Quilt Museum. Next. This is the piece that I have hanging in the exhibit. It is called Tonight, God is in the House. I've made a few quilts referencing jazz, and this one is based on William Gottlieb's public domain photo of Art Tatum. Gottlieb is best known for his portraits of leading jazz musicians, pardon me, in the 1930s and 40s. Art Tatum was one of the greatest jazz pianists of all time, and his work is still studied. The story goes that one evening Tatum walked into a club where Fats Waller was playing. Fats reportedly said, "I only play the piano, but tonight God is in the house." The idea of fracturing the portrait is representative of how I view jazz. The music and picture maintain the core rhythm while the musicians and threads expand, improvise, and play with the melody. Tatum was a master. Next. The bulk of my work start with photographs. I love breaking apart photos and putting them back together in different ways. I use apps and photo editing software, primarily Photoshop, to manipulate and work with the photos. This piece, Tiger Eye, is another side of fracturing images and creating a type of mosaic quilt. Each button or bead is hand sewn to a quilt base. Next. Liberty Marches was made for and traveled with the Threads of Resistance exhibit. I selected images of protest signs from the first Women's March, manipulated them in Photoshop, and then placed them on the image of the Statue of Liberty. The idea being that since Lady Liberty couldn't physically march, she called all the signs to her and proudly wears them. The end result was then printed twice, cut, woven, and stitched. Next. This piece, Choices, was part of the 2017 juried artist member show Junctures at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. This is an image of the electric trolley bus lines in San Francisco and seemed perfect to me to symbolize the definition of juncture, all of the choices that are confusing and possible. Next. I am drawn primarily to images with depth and dimension when I'm doing the mosaics, as well as flora. Consequently, the echinacea keeps reappearing in my work. I'm grateful that in the language of flowers, it has many meanings just to make coming up with titles easier. This one is Be Strong. Next. And I'm really sorry, I'm having an allergy attack, evidently. This piece, Seaside Succulent, currently traveling with Quilt National, depicts another recurring love of mine, succulents. One of the appeals of this mosaic process is being able to look at the piece in two different ways. From far away, they appear as highly defined and dimensional images. And the closer you get, they get more diffused and just become a tapestry of buttons and beads. And I also like the tactile nature of it. Next. This is one of my more recent pieces called White Door. I'm married to a photographer, and Kurt lets me commandeer images from time to time. This began as one of his photos of an old adobe in disrepair in Antonchico, New Mexico. Part of the process is trying to take out the background colors in the photo just enough so that when I print it, I can see the color of the fabric that I'm printing those images on. Next. I live in a very small 1,650 foot square house. No, it's not square, it's a square foot house. Okay. I subscribe to the philosophy that you should never live in anything larger than you're willing to clean, and by rights, I should probably be living in a 500 square foot house. When my son moved out, I took over his tiny bedroom as a guest bedroom / supply room. In actuality, I don't think there is a room in the house that doesn't have art supplies in it. The 4 bottom shelves on the right of the left-hand image are bead storage. but I also have another rolling cart elsewhere that is full of beads as well. The closet, the image on the right, is a picture of the rolling carts that I have that house the buttons. But again, there are boxes, jars, bags of buttons stuffed under beds elsewhere in the house. Next. The printer that I use is an Epson P800. It's a pigment-based inkjet printer that can print up to 16 inches wide. And I either use a type of butcher paper or temporarily adhere fabric to cardstock to run the fabric through the printer. Next. And this is my primary work area. Highly portable, able to pick up and move should I ever have company again. But it is a corner of my living room, dining room. Small, effective, and it works. And I get to look out the front window. So thank you for listening. And next artist is Sarah Entsminger.
Hello, I'm Sarah Entsminger, and I live and work in Northern Virginia. Next slide. My artwork, Night Music on the Water, was juried into the Musica exhibition. My work is primarily landscape-based, and as I thought about the concept of music and the importance of music in our lives, my mind immediately went to the sounds of nature. Mother Nature provides music daily, from streams slipping over rocks, animals calling to each other, ocean waves crashing, and the leaves of trees whispering in the breeze. So I continued to think about music and nature's music. My thoughts were not of sweet bird songs, but rather dramatic storm sounds. For some reason, my memories of storms are usually of those that occurred at night. Soft rain and sunlight does not seem to stand out in my memories in quite the same way. Storms are one of nature's grandest melodies, cracks of lightning, low rumbles of thunder building to loud booms like timpani drums. Clouds, turbulent water, and waving grasses, all overlaid with sheets of rain, continue to create the feeling of a dramatic storm passing through this piece. I'll describe the process I use to create night music and many of my other pieces as we look through these slides. Next, please. This is a photograph that I took at Morven Park and edited it to create the feeling of emotion that I look for in the places that I've visited. I've always been interested in different art mediums, although today I tend to limit my work to textile art, pastel painting, and photography. Regardless of which medium is being used, personal photographs and memories inform my work. My photographs include elements of texture, color, line, and other details of nature. Sometimes I will include ideas from several different photographs within a single artwork. My work is about trying to recreate feelings and emotions that are related to place. Our memories of place are complicated, colored by experiences and the people associated with those places. But most of my work is landscape-based because I find the natural world to be healing. It also calms and centers me. Next, please. I primarily use hand-dyed fabrics in my work. Because of significant respiratory issues, I do not dye my own fabric, but instead source from other talented artists. Hand-dyed fabrics are really one of a kind. Those differences are created by the individual artists, their process, and their particular choice of pigments and dyes. A single piece of hand-dyed fabric may have many different color and tone changes across the surface of the fabric. Do you remember that game we played as children, trying to describe the shapes that we could see in the clouds? Well, that's exactly how I look at fabrics. Can I see any images or feelings of place? If a piece of fabric speaks to me, I buy it regardless of whether I have a specific project in mind or not, as that particular piece of hand-dyed fabric will most likely never come through my hands again. Next, please. This piece is called West Bay Sunrise. I have learned that reducing the elements of an image down to the essentials necessary to create a sense of place allows me to make work that leaves room for the viewer to experience the work as a reflection of their own memories of place. Most often, my work consists of sky, water, and land with a clear horizon line. I also often feature changes in weather in my work. Next, please. My studio is in my home. I am fortunate to have space for work tables. 2 at counter height and 2 at desk height. I move between the work tables, the design wall, and my sewing machine. And while that sounds a bit like the magic triangle that kitchen designers talk about, it does work. Wonderful natural light streams in through the windows, keeping me connected to the landscape outside. I keep my fabrics in ventilated bins in the closet, separated by color. Keeping my fabrics out of the workspace, except for specific projects under production, allows me to concentrate without the siren's call of color distracting me. Next, please. This piece is Summer at North Graham Marsh. I often begin a piece with 1 or 2 fabrics, used alone or pieced together to create the base layer. I work on a piece while it is on the design wall, or more often taking it down, working on the tables, moving between the tables. I just have to keep an eye out for the iron cord, which never seems to be where it should. As I work, I'm continually adding other bits of fabric or painting in order to achieve the effect that I want. At many different stages, I stop and photograph my progress. By looking at the photo, I can tell whether different elements are working together, if something important is missing, or if it's just becoming a hot mess. The camera becomes a non-partial observer and helps my process. Next, please. Fabric has been used as a substrate by artists for centuries. After all, canvas is fabric. I don't begin by mounting my fabric on stretcher bars like many painters, as that removes much of the versatility that's inherent in being able to manipulate the fabric throughout the creation of the artwork. The weave of the fabric will accept a wide variety of fine art mediums. And I've experimented with many, and I continue with each new product that comes to the market. I keep most of my art supplies in my studio, so the choices are easily accessible. Most often art supplies used include acrylic paint, Japanese inks, acrylic inks, colored pencils, wax pastel, or fine-tipped markers. My favorite is probably colored pencil, particularly the soft pigments by Prismacolor that seem to sink into the weave of the fabric rather than sitting on the top, which is also one of the best qualities of the translucent inks as well. Next, please. Rough water is an example of a single fabric as the base layer with an image built on the top of that layer. I don't like to draft patterns for specific pieces that are needed. Creating patterns seems to slow me down, and it forces me to follow rules. I don't like rules, even if the rules are ones that I make for myself. And that lack of freedom can shut down my creativity if I'm not careful to remember to just trust myself. I usually cut freehand the elements that need to be added. Sometimes I use sharp scissors to cut smaller pieces, but my preferred method is to freehand cut with the rotary cutter. Freehand cutting looks more organic to me and closer to nature. Next, please. Being able to manipulate the fabric throughout the process allows me to use a wide variety of threads as the final layer. The stitching is not just to hold the layers together. The threads illustrate details, add depth, texture, and movement. A sense of movement is critical to scenes of water, land, or sky. I apply the threads by both hand and machine, using whichever method will give the desired result. Next, please. Morning Rain illustrates much of what I've talked about today. 2 fabrics, sky and water, comprise the base layer. The feel of moving water is created by adding many, and I do mean many, small slivers of fabrics to the base layer. The sunrise is painted primarily with colored pencil. The clouds are painted with a variety of translucent inks. The white surf is painted with acrylic paint, and wax pastel was added to give depth to the water. I used thread to quilt the sky with lines of rain and to create additional movement in the water. This is very similar to the process of creating night music, which was the first image and my entry to Musica. The difference is that the ground in night music was a single fabric with lots and lots of threads used to create the grasses, and only a small hint of water can be seen in the distance. Next, please. Art has always been a constant in my life, both as a refuge or solace when needed, as well as a way to make sense of the world around me. My mother taught me to notice the beauty in the smallest details of nature and how natural elements work together to create our place in the world. Reflections of the natural world continue to fascinate me, as I walk with camera in hand, looking for the next story to be told. Next, we'll hear from Sue.
Hi, I'm Sue Sherman. I'm from Newmarket in Ontario, Canada. It's just north of Toronto, and I would have been local to the SAQA conference in Toronto had it taken place in its original physical location. When I first saw SAQA's call for entries for the Musica exhibit, I realized it was perfect for me. Music has been a lifelong passion. So I felt a degree of pressure to come up with a perfect musical quilt idea. Not easy, really. To me, quilts are all about the visual, and music is all about the sound, the feel, the experience. Around that time, the street artist Banksy caused an international sensation when the painting Girl with Balloon sold for $1.4 million at auction and then promptly shredded itself. For weeks afterwards, people I knew who didn't even care about art were talking about it. They were astonished by the sum paid, appalled at the disrespect, upset that a street artist would be taken seriously, intrigued by the audacity, a wide variety of opinions, including a whole lot of discussion as to whether the shredding constituted part of the artwork or not. Girl with Balloon shook things up, made everyone think, and visual art became richer as a result. That made me think about a similar disruptive moment in music, the debut of American composer John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds in 1952. It was before I was even born, but the reaction must have been similar. The debut of a new piece by a minimalist composer, 3 movements totaling 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which the pianist was in playing position but did not touch any keys. I imagine that there were those in the audience who wanted their money back. There was certainly a great deal of discussion about whether the work qualified as music or not, and that debate continues to this day in some musical circles. My idea was to create this quilt depicting the name of the musical piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, as a color blindness test, in which small circles in 2 different colors are arranged so that the difference between the colors is what your eye uses to discern a letter or shape. I hand-dyed a variety of shades of red and green and fixed 2-sided fusible interfacing to the back. Then I used an AccuQuilt cutter, a die cutter, to cut out lots of perfect circles of various sizes and arrange them on the quilt, using a pure white background for contrast. Next. This slide shows how the quilt would look to someone who is red-green colorblind. As you can see, the numbers are essentially invisible, so that if you are colorblind, you would completely miss the point of this quilt, which parallels the way some people view this piece of music. And I apologize to any colorblind people watching this, as I don't have the Photoshop skills to make it so that you can see the numbers. Next. When it came to quilting the piece, I wanted to go back to basics. My message here is that the only reason disruption works as an artistic statement is because we have a standard to begin with. I needed to fill the entire shape of the quilt with quilting to depict the musical basics, and I needed to make sure the musical notation was accurate and plausible. So I created this E-flat major scale graphic, complete with pedal and dynamic markings and a cadence. It's machine quilted in white so as to take its rightful place in the background of the quilt. Next. These are some of my early quilts made using a similar raw edge applique technique, except that the pieces are cut into irregular shapes using scissors rather than die cut. They are both turtles photographed by my husband when we lived in Hawaii, and they were made using custom hand-dyed fabric and raw edge applique. I've had some success selling kit versions of these quilts to other quilters, so they are quite easy to make. Next. These days, I've been doing a lot more painting with thickened dyes directly onto the background fabric. This piece is about 50 inches wide. I love the versatility of this dye painting. I can depict almost anything and can vary the look from broad brush strokes to painstaking detail of the rocks and the feathers of these penguins. The main drawback, and it's a big one, is that there is very little scope to correct mistakes using this technique. Once this dye goes into the fabric, it is difficult, sometimes impossible, to remove. Next. This is me seated at the dining room table in February, painting a king penguin. I started by tracing the image onto the treated white fabric, and then used paintbrushes to apply the thickened dye. Like other dye techniques, you leave it to cure for 24 hours, and then wash out the spent dye. The result is a whole cloth quilt top that is essentially a piece of printed cotton fabric. The picture on the right is the same quilt being quilted in my studio on my sit-down long arm machine. I'm using matching tri-lobal polyester thread for a nice sheen, and including neon orange and yellow to make the brights really pop. Next. Some of my best quilts start with great photographs. This is a weaver bird I photographed serendipitously at the moment of takeoff above my head. I created the quilt using the same technique just shown for the penguins, with the addition of some specialty habu yarns couched to create the nest. The piece is about life size at 26 by 26 inches, and it's currently part of the Aloft exhibit with SAQA. Next. These two quilts are the same technique in the same materials, but with a different look, a Galapagos penguin and a Sally Lightfoot crab. These are small quilts, both around 18 inches in the long dimension. Next. Here's a Galapagos tortoise, also in the same technique and around 24 inches wide. Next. And a final Galapagos animal quilt, the blue-footed booby. This is around 30 inches wide. Next. And now it's time for our next speaker, Carolyn Skei.
Hi, everyone from McKinney, which is in North Texas, and hello from a wonderful group of SAQA quilters in North Texas, several of whom are chimed in today. My first slide shows the quilt that made it into Musica, and also shows the photograph on which the quilt is based. Most of my friends call this my guitar quilt, but I named it San Antonio on my mind because the photograph was taken in San Antonio's vibrant marketplace 2 years ago when SAQA held its big international conference there. I've been an avid photographer for many years, so quite a few of my quilts are based on photographs, but I'm going to show you next some quilts that are not based on photographs. Many of us quilters make quilts because we want to celebrate what's bright and beautiful and fun, but other times I think we have to contend with what we need to get off our chests. And these are two totally improvisational pieces where I was dealing with something on my chest. The piece on the left, which is as much a book or a scroll as it is a quilt, was created at the time of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The one on the right remains a favorite of mine, and I think it is a favorite because there's something about the way the raw, rough, hand-dyed fabric and the wild hand stitching contrast with the very even machine stitching on the green silk. And those two, that contrast of those two things somehow or another captures the way chaos broke through order on that very tragic day at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The next slide shows two more pieces that I suppose could be classified as activist works. The one on the left was created at the time of the Las Vegas massacre. I couldn't take myself away from the news, so I grabbed a piece of canvas that I had from Home Depot and a bunch of pens and started writing down the words of all of the commentators and reporters. So the quilt background includes everything from the words of the Second Amendment to words like carnage. As the canvas filled up and I had smaller and smaller spaces to write, I began to record sentences from magazine articles. One of the sentences on the quilt talks about a victim of the massacre, and it says simply, he was walking toward the stage to hear his favorite song. The kimono on the right was created just last fall for Dallas area fiber artists' recycled runway show. It is made entirely of drapery and upholstery scraps, or samples, I should say, from an interior design studio. The two halves of the front contrast a sick planet with a well planet, and on the back of the kimono are the very brave words of young Greta Thunberg when she challenged world leaders in New York at a meeting of the UN. The next slide does take us to quilts that are inspired by photographs. Not long after I took Susie Monday's Art on the iPad for Quilters class, I was playing around with a photograph from a cookbook, a pear cookbook. And when my app turned the background black and the fruit red, I suddenly thought, oh, I think I can make a quilt out of that. So that quilt has been shown quite a few times in quite a few places with the permission of the photographer of the pear. The quilt on the right is not based on iPad manipulation at all. That's simply a photograph that I took at the Dallas Arboretum many years ago, and I always loved the shapes and the contrasts. So when SAQA announced its upcycle exhibit, I dug into a bin full of old blue jeans and old faded denim shirts, and this was the outcome. The next slide shows you Texas Boy with Fish, based on a photograph of my grandson with his first big fish. I loved the silhouette, the backlighting, the gesture of holding up the big fish. So I played with it on my iPad, and you can see on the right the result that I got on one occasion with my iPad, and decided at that point, okay, I can make a quilt out of this. And then as you look at the finished quilt, you can see that I continued to have fun with things like the decorative stitching on my machine. The next slide shows you a very tiny quilt, which had its 10 minutes of fame in San Antonio at that same SAQA conference. Willow the Armadillo was in the spotlight auction in San Antonio, and she went for $900, which was a tremendous thrill for me. She's not based on a photograph. Instead, she's based on an iPad drawing that I had made for a totally different purpose. That's in the upper right-hand corner. And then in the left corner, you can see an iPad version that did not become a quilt and probably won't ever become a quilt, but I included it here to show you what fun can be had with iPad manipulation of your various images. The next slide takes you to my largest quilt to date. Elba Isle Hancock, which honors my maternal grandmother, is 6 feet tall by 2 feet wide. It was made for the Celebration of Women exhibit in Houston a couple of years ago, but it's gone on to a number of other shows and some really nice honors. And the picture on the right was taken last fall at San Diego's beautiful Visions Art Museum, where she was a part of their interpretation show. The next slide takes you to my work area. That table with pipe legs was created for me by my son-in-law, and it is quite literally the center of my universe. If you had a picture of it at Christmas Eve this last Christmas, you would have found it loaded with Christmas dishes and food and surrounded by chairs and family. And I do have another table in another part of the house, but this is the one where the light is right and where I quilt a lot. My grandchildren are college age now, so I can go many days without having to clean this up and make room for anyone else to come and eat. The folding table on the right does not always sit in that passageway to the patio door. It comes in from the garage when a project is especially large or complicated. And that chopping block on wheels actually lives about 6 paces to the left in the center of my kitchen. But I rolled it into this photograph because it is used as much for chopping fabric as it is for chopping vegetables. We'll go through those double doors to the next slide, which is where most of my stash is kept. It's not ever this neat, but I do clean house for company, and you guys are the first company I've had since January, with the exception of my daughter. You can sort of get the feel for how this mess all can come up, how it can be used. The baskets on the top contain things like ribbons and lace, and the ones down below contain PFD fabric, batting, and things like that. On the wall further along, you can see where I store large sheets of paper for book binding. They're draped over old-fashioned curtain rods. The next slide takes you to where I sew. There's no long arm here, just a relatively young Juki and a 65-year-old Elna that comes out of its container once in a while. It still purrs and I still love it. This is a corner of my guest bedroom. So when an out-of-town guest comes, a few baskets get shoved around to make room for suitcases, and it serves that purpose too. The tabletop along the window wall is actually a hollow core door that is padded and covered with fabric to be a fusing and ironing surface. And the door is so lightweight that I can actually lift it off and carry it into that first room that you saw if I need to use it on that folding table and have a surface that I can walk all the way around. The next slide takes us back to the guitar quilt and shows you a little bit of the process. The image that's sitting on an angle is the iPad image that I settled on as my inspiration. I blew it up in Photoshop to the size I wanted the quilt to be. I took it to my FedEx, where they have one of those giant printers that you can use yourself, and printed what could be regarded as a full-size pattern for the quilt. You can see how I have outlined with Sharpie pen on plastic the main outlines of the quilt, so that I had something to guide me as I assembled the various components of the quilt. If you look at the 2 colored images in the bottom row of guitars on those 2, you will see that I was changing my mind about what colors I wanted the actual quilt guitars to be. And you can see, because there's one guitar still missing, along with a few other pieces, that I had not made up my mind what color I wanted the guitar under the white guitar to be. The last slide shows you what color I chose for that missing guitar. It also shows you some of the detailed stitching on the quilt. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a totally different iPad version of that same photograph, which I'm now enjoying printing on linen and using on greeting cards. So these guitars help me hear mariachi music, and I hope that quilt helps you hear the same. I think it's back to Rachael now.
Yes. Well, thank you, artists. This has been fascinating. It's obvious that that music is very important to you. And but tell us, do you listen to music while you're working? And if you do, what type of music do you listen to? Sue Bianchi, we'll start with you.
Actually, I rarely listen to music while working. Oddly enough, I think it's primarily because there are generally people in the house, and if I have to listen to it, they do. So I tend to listen to music when I'm on my own or in the car. And it
Thank you.
runs a wide variety from jazz to musical comedy to pop. You name it, I listen to it.
Wonderful. Sue Sherman, what about you in a studio? Do you enjoy music?
I enjoy music a lot, but I don't normally have it playing in my studio. I find that if I want to listen to music, it's a whole body thing for me. I don't just do it casually while I'm doing something else. I do like to listen to all kinds of music. I like jazz, I like pop music, mostly what they call adult contemporary kind of pop, and a wide variety of classical music, including opera and symphonic music and concerti and things like that.
Thank you. Sarah, what about you?
Well, I've been thinking about the music in my studio, and I guess it depends on what I'm doing, actually. So if I'm trying to concentrate, if I have any music on, it's usually just instrumental. I find that lyrics tend to kind of break my concentration. But if it is tasks that I don't particularly find as fun, like facing or binding a quilt, then I will play louder, much more upbeat music just to kind of keep me going and make sure that I finish.
Wonderful. Carolyn, tell us what you prefer.
I don't listen at all to music while I'm working on my quilts. There's something about getting into the creative zone that I think the music would somehow or another distract me, draw me away. I'm a news junkie, so I sometimes keep the news running low in the background, but it's not unusual for me to work with no noise at all other than neighborhood noises outside my screen door.
Thank you all. Martha, do we have time for another question?
Yes, go right ahead.
Well, tell us also, artists, what do you do when a piece isn't working? How do you manage that when something in your mind is not quite translating into the actual work? Sue Sherman, can we start with you?
I have two things that I do. One thing is that I just walk away from it and leave it for a few days, even a week, a month maybe, and come back to it, and I find that whatever it was that was blocking it has magically disappeared, and it all works. My other thing that I might do is do something small. Often if I'm working on a really big piece, I'll do a 12 by 12 or even a postcard size, 4 by 6 of some excerpt from it, just to get myself in the mood for how that particular subject matter is going to work. And I find that once I've done 2, 3, even 5 or 6 steady pieces, the bigger piece becomes more obvious.
Thank you. Carolyn, what do you do?
I'm a big believer in letting your subconscious work on things. So if it isn't working, I might just tack it up on the design wall. And one of two things will happen in a day or 2 or 3 or maybe a week. I'll suddenly know what I want to do with it, or I will find myself walking past it as if it's non-existent. And when that happens, it means it probably has no future and it's time to fuse something over the top of it.
Thank you. Sarah, what about you?
Well, as I said earlier, I take photographs a lot while I'm actually working on something to see how the progress is going. And I think it depends on how bad the problem is. Some things are fixable. Some things just need to sit and marinate for a little bit longer. They need to stay on the design wall and the sun will come and go and maybe something will come to mind. If it's really bad, then I have been known to wad it up, walk it to the curb, put it in the trash can. Some things can't be fixed. And if you keep something in your studio that you know can't be fixed, it's just like a dark cloud in the corner and it has to go.
I agree. Sue Bianchi, what about you? How do you handle something?
A lot of things get cut up and put onto the backs of quilts if it doesn't work. I've got one particular button one that was kind of exceptionally large that I got halfway done with, and it was just crap. It is currently living in my garage, wadded up, that I occasionally go out and cut off buttons to be used elsewhere. So it's a work in process as to how I deal with it on any given day.
There you go. Thank you all, artists. Martha, you ready for questions from our audience?
Yes, we sure do. Before I pass along the questions for the artists, Rachel, I was wondering if you could tell everybody what the museum's experience has been opening your doors on Monday.
It has been, we were very prepared. We made sure that we had everything, the hand sanitizer, mask, had the shield in front of the admission ticket desk and the gift shop. We want to be sure that everybody is safe but still enjoy the experience. And so it's you just kind of walk on tippy toes a little bit because you're not quite sure what to expect. You're hoping that people will come and enjoy the experience, and I think they have. So people are still walking around the museum. Still getting very close to the quilt because everybody wants to see the details, but with masks on. And then so much of what we do in the museum is that personal connection. We like to be able to talk to visitors when they come in. But we do that keeping our social distance. So we still are trying to maintain the experience that everyone expects, wants, enjoys, but being safe.
Yeah, well, thank you for being willing to be the sort of pioneers in reopening. I'm glad that it's going well so far.
Yeah.
A lot of the questions that we got from the audience have to do with the technical aspects of the work that the four artists do. Carolyn, I'm going to start with you. We had a lot of different questions from people who wanted to know what apps do you use on your iPad, and can you say again what the class was that you took?
Oh, well, the class is taught by Susie Monday, Monday, online. It's a terrific class. I think she has people taking it online, even from overseas. You'll find it a very user-friendly class. My favorite apps for on my iPad have turned out to be Megaphoto and Dreamscope. I guess those two I would mention to start out with.
Okay, thank you. Sue Bianchi, everybody wanted to know, with your button pieces, where do you get the buttons? What do you put them on? And how much do they weigh when you're finished? And maybe what size they are so that people can guesstimate for themselves.
The Seaside Succulent piece is 25 by 25 inches. It actually weighs about 8 pounds. So they're not unmanageable. The smaller ones, the two other ones that I showed were only 10 by 10 and 12 by 12. Those are about a pound, maybe a little more a piece. So it really obviously depends on the size of the piece. The buttons and beads, I actually have been gifted with amazingly generous friends. I've also been known to buy major poundage on eBay. I go to every junk store and antique store, and you can find, depending on the state, they can be amazingly cheap. Here in California, they are not. So I tend not to buy a lot here.
And what's the substrate that you attach them on? Is some kind of canvas?
No, actually, it's quilting cotton, front and back. I tend to use black. I do a batting, which will either be just a normal black batting or felt with a layer of medium weight stabilizer, and baste those all together and then just start sewing them on. Actually, you finish the entire piece, you bind it, you put the sleeve on and without sewing the bottom part of it, and then you apply all of the buttons and beads.
Yeah. Sarah, there is a technical question for you. They wanted to know about how you have experienced color fastness for colored pencil work.
Color fastness is always an issue with any supply that you might use that's an art supply. And that is, and I have to tell you, that's one of the places where quality makes a difference of what you're using. So as long as the product is a good quality, you'll find that the pigment is not as fugitive as it might be in some of the less expensive things. I don't use anything that can't be heat set. So I do heat set the color pencil, and I've never had any problems with the color pencil disappearing. If I don't set the wax pastel, it might be fugitive, but the rest of it is all heat set. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you know, we're not making pieces that you would actually wash. I mean, these are things that you would put on the wall, and you wouldn't take any other picture off the wall and throw it in the washing machine. So I doubt that you would wash mine either.
And there was a follow-up question about what size are your landscape pieces? Generally.
Landscape pieces are all over the board. Night Music that's in Musica is a 38 by 40. The West Bay Sunrise was it's a small one. It's 12 inches wide, 22 inches long. Summer at North Grand Marsh, 29 by 39. Rough Water's also another long one. It's 18 inches wide, 44 inches long. Morning Rain was about 33 by 53. And the little self-portrait was 8 by 10.
Oh, thank you. And then Sue, Sherman, can you talk a little bit about how you work to get your photos onto fabric?
It's very low tech. Most of the time I project the image onto the wall, and then I use a pencil to trace it onto a piece of paper, and then I take the paper on my window and trace it onto the fabric using Prismacolor pencils.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Carolyn, there's a request to repeat the name of the two apps because some people didn't catch them.
Mega Photo and Dream Scope.
Thank you. So let me type that in, Mega Photo and Dream, Scope. All right, that's in the chat. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's been fascinating to hear from the artists and to see the exhibit at the National Quilt Museum. And I want to thank Rachael so much for being willing to be our moderator. And I want to thank our 4 artists for being brave enough to come and share what they're talking about. We've been getting tons of comments thanking you all for sharing your artwork, sharing where you create, and sharing what inspires you. Thank you all so much. Really enjoyed being with you this afternoon.